got Chris D'Souza, we have John Baer, Isabel Zhang, and Michael Cole down there. So I'm going to let each of you introduce your organizations, your area of specialty, and then we can dig into some of the nitty-gritty around the way we do what we do. You?
Christopher D'Souza. So I'm with a philanthropic venture firm called Broadview Ventures. We are a single LP fund. The family, the Leduc Family Trust, when they sold their business, put their money into a irrevocable trust, all dedicated towards advancing medical sciences and having an clinical impact. And because of a long history of cardiovascular disease in the family, all of the funds go towards, with a focus on cardiovascular, which is quite broad. It includes metabolic, includes stroke, but that's where we invest in. But we're agnostic to technology, so we do drugs, devices, diagnostics. Broadview is the sister of the first organization, which was the foundation, which funds academic research, now in excess of $500 million in grants, again in cardiovascular, metabolic, and stroke. And the genesis of Broadview was the grants get great publications, they don't get the patient. So our goal is to help accelerate translation. I think you have all faced that situation. Come back to us when you have data, but you need money to get the data. And so we come in with $1 million to help you cross that valley of death and get you to a point where you're better positioned to raise your next round. We're Boston-based.
So my name is Jonathan Baer. I'm a partner at the Dementia Discovery Fund as of 2 months ago. The Dementia Discovery Fund is a 250 million British pound fund that is a specialty fund focused on age-related dementias. So that includes Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS, FTD, PSP, so well beyond Alzheimer's disease. The fund is managed by SV Health Investors, which is a very long-standing life science venture capital group, as well as healthcare and growth, et cetera. The original LP base was a group of pharmaceutical companies, UK government, and charities. It was set up to be a strategic fund to ensure that there were exciting new shots on goal in neurodegenerative disease. So we don't invest in anything related to the amyloid hypothesis. We have a very high bar for things relating to tau, for example. We really like to look for new approaches. The fund is Boston and US based. We'll invest seed through late stage companies. We can put up to 15 million pounds or so into an individual company. It doesn't buy as much as it used to, but that's how we model it. My background, I came from the JDRF T1D fund, where I was the first managing director of that fund. Isabella will tell you all about that one.
Hi everyone, this is Isabella Zhang from JDRF T1D Fund. So JDRF T1D Fund is a venture philanthropy fund. It was funded about 3 years ago, close 3 years ago, at the venture arm of JDRF. So as the leading funding organization in the type 1 diabetes field, JDRF has input $2 billion non-dilutive funding in this disease for research in the past 50 years. But still there's no cure. That's why they want to start this fund to catalyze the investment market for T1D and also to accelerate the therapy and development of those treatment into the clinic. So the JDRF volunteers funded the fund at the beginning of 2017. So we consider us a strategic value-adding investor. We support the mission of JDRF. We bring our own experience as well as the full leverage of JDRF resources and the KOL network to support our company. T1D Fund actually, we raise our funding separately from JDRF, and we run our investment process as a traditional VC and make our investment decision independently of JDRF. In the past close to 2.5 years, we built a team of dedicated investment professionals. We make investment in different companies. We make investment in companies which are fully T1D focused, as well as companies has multiple indication and technology platform, which could be applied to Q&A in a meaningful way. And we are stage and geography agnostic, and we actually really looking for opportunities to invest along opportunities to therapeutics, breakthrough type therapeutics to invest along with financially motivated investors. And all of our capital are donated in almost all the cases through high net worth individuals who normally has personal connections with type 1 diabetes, and they want to see the clinical progress through our efforts. And the fund is evergreen structure, so all the proceeds will go back to the fund and reinvest into different companies. I joined the fund in 2017 as a first hired in the investment team after John Bear. And my background, I was in the private equity and venture capital field. And then before that, I was a scientist, did drug R&D, have a PhD in chemistry and MBA. That was before I joined the fund.
So I'm Michael Cole with Global NeuroHealth Ventures. So we were formed clinicians, neuroscientists, healthcare administrators, and venture capitalists. All UC Berkeley faculty, we teamed together to address this area that we saw as a big need for funding, specifically within the clinical neurosciences. Several of us had these anecdotal experiences that it seemed like the companies, it's tough to get, obviously, funding early stage, but the companies within the clinical neurosciences were having an even tougher time getting funding. And so we took a look at the data from Silicon Valley Bank and PitchBook and looked at especially across the last 10 years and saw that, in fact, there's general trends for some of the funding going down for early stage last 2 to 3 years, but it's been especially precipitous for companies targeting psychiatric and neurological treatments, interventions, diagnostics, etc. So based on that, we decided to join forces and raise a fund, Global NeuroHealth Ventures. And so given that background, obviously we're targeting early stage to really help during that trajectory to maintain funding until the companies become more attractive in terms of acquisitions by pharma and the like, or IPO, etc. And so what else? I think we're going to circle back to some other details, but broad strokes. So our scope is any kind of intervention that will significantly benefit psychiatric or neurological patient populations. So it's actually a pretty broad spectrum that we're interested in, including therapeutics, diagnostics, medical device, as well as digital health.
Good. So we're going to move on to some questions and try actually a couple of new things. But first, I just like to get a feel of who's in the room for the panelists here. Startups, entrepreneurs. Good, healthy part. Yeah. Other investors. Other service providers. Other things. Good. Thank you. We're going to actually try something a little bit different. I'm going to put out some ideas and concepts in which the panelists are each going to respond to, and then we're going to open it up to a couple questions around those themes, and then move on to the next one. We'll see how that goes. Okay. And the first one I want people to address is this concept of, for us as impact mission-based investors, how do we balance mission and return? This is a little bit of a change from previous panels in other years, which was a venture philanthropy. This is investing, this is impact investing. I think everyone here is thinking about returns, but we are balancing some other priorities. For my organization in particular, one of the ways we think about this is we have a philosophy that you can't get to market, you can't get your solution to the kids who need it if you can't make the economics work, get other investors in, all of that. So we don't give anything on that. We'll go early, and so that's a risky area, but we don't give anything on returns to further our mission. We're trying to figure out how to make it work with great returns. But everybody here is going to have a little bit different angle or perspective on it, whether it's unique to them or all of us, but I know that each of the people here has some really good perspective on how to think about those two things under one umbrella.
So I think the difference between impact investing and financial return, I've seen a lot of VC slides say, here's how many patients we've impacted, but first we're making money, right? We, on the other hand, are saying, how many patients can we impact? And then is there a business plan to get it done? Because as John says, even as an investor, it takes so many tens, if not hundreds of millions in our business. Our couple of dollars is not going to move it forward, but or move the needle significantly to get to market, but it will move it forward to a point where other investors, we've de-risked it for other investors to come in. But those investors are not going to come in unless there is a financial gain to be had. And so the only difference I see when I sit at Broadview Ventures is we first look at clinical impact. And then we look to say, okay, that's going to be a clinical, that's innovative, that's revolutionary, that's not incremental or, a me too. It's really going to have an impact on patients' health and well-being. Okay, now is their business. If we invest $1 million and we get them to that milestone, will others come in? So I think that's really the difference that I see as an impact investor versus a financial investor.
And I think where I agree with John and Christopher is that you need to have an investable business model, and investable to a purely financial investor, or else the company will not succeed and you won't deliver medicines. I think how we measure our own success is different, and that affects deal structures. So I've been at a purely financial venture group, I've been in a nonprofit venture group, and now this group is for-profit but mission-focused. Sometimes I describe the DEDF, and we describe ourselves as a sector-specific fund, just like you buy a REIT or a biotech, mutual fund. But the difference there is the investors just look at return, and they don't actually ask whether any of the companies they invested in are successful. I think there are unfortunate examples and many of them, of companies that really were not on track to deliver medicines but made good returns for their investors. I think we would not be seen as successful by our limited partners if we returned, the top quartile IRR for our sector, but none of our companies delivered medicines. I don't think we would be seen as a success. Simultaneously, I don't think we would be seen as a success if we had lower quartile returns and delivered medicines, or some medicines. If we delivered 100, if we cured Alzheimer's disease, nobody would care. But I think the other underlying belief that I have, and I think probably everybody else at the table has, is if you truly are delivering medicine and doing, those two, the return correlates. So I think there are certain select investments we can't do, even in our space, just because we don't believe that a medicine is going to be the end of the road, even if we think we could make a return. But at the end of the day, we just have a much more difficult problem than a traditional investor, in that we have to get a yes answer to two different questions instead of one. We have to say we think this will get the eventual return, and we think it'll have a positive impact. So just one of those.
I agree. So we think returns on mission, because based on a 2014 study, it shows the full cost to develop a drug from discovery to FDA approval is about $2.5 billion. So it just, no matter how much we raise and invest, it's not going to be enough just by us to support the drug from discovery to the patients. That's why it's very important for us to invest in those good companies actually can attract other capital rather than not only us, so they can take the drug through the long R&D process. And good companies just naturally bring back returns. And the return, in our case, we're evergreen fund, so the return actually will go back to the fund and reinvest. And when we are looking at a company, mission in the first lens, we want to make sure the company definitely has the potential to impact T1D, But after that, we look at the deal holistically. As other VC, we want to look at the company, the management team, the science, the business plan, and IP and return, because that's all put together if it's a good investment, good company. So we look at, it kind of like a return is a mean to the end, even we just want having the mission, so it's all together.
So for structuring the impact nature of our fund, it was actually a really interesting process that we did a lot of background research in terms of what would have the best kind of tuning from that end that we could achieve the mission that we have most effectively. And we played around with a lot of different potential structuring, and what we landed on is to really operationalize it fairly specifically. And so with it, essentially the basis of it is the agreements that we have with our LPs, that our selection process for companies, specifically half of it is the more traditional looking at returns, but then the other half in terms of what's weighted for our decision process is the social cost. And the extent to which what the company is doing can effectively address that. And very much so specifically quantified too, so drawing from World Health Organization measurements for different disease states to how well is a disease state currently addressed with what's out there. In close to 24 different indices that feed into kind of quantifying how well the company and their associated innovation or innovations can address the social cost of the disease state. So it's a combination of both those weighted equally to really determine our investments.
So I hear a couple things here. One important point that it's always worth emphasizing, I think, is that with investors like this group here, there's an extra burden on the company coming in. It's not an easier path going to the people who are focused on your area. It's a hard one. You've really got to prove out, in addition to all the normal investment things, you've got to prove out your value in their area of interest. One of the benefits is they'll probably take the time to take a closer look than some other investors might do it. But any questions on this particular topic for anyone here?
I guess a quick one. So obviously, the traditional VC model is that you have to try to show, 5, 10, or upwards X return in order, like in terms of market size and whatnot, for them to really, pay attention to you. As far as then when you're doing, the financial and the business model analysis, do you have certain cutoffs in terms of like, okay, well, if we can see a path where they can get to a 2X return, okay, that should be fine. So basically, not just like, okay, economic and impact is both important, but like, are there certain metrics that you use then on the financial side that are acting as cutoffs, a 2X return? Does it just have to return the money that gets invested back into it? Like what are some of those financial metrics that you kind of use as gatekeepers for, for that kind of analysis?
Not so much. We don't have a financial return requirement at Broadview Ventures. Longview does. I think more importantly, it's and towards Jordan's point, is you're going to have a bigger burden coming in because you have to prove to us what is the impact of your program. With that said, you have a better chance of getting early stage funding because we are unencumbered by the need to make money. Well, we'll take that risk. What we're looking for is, what's your next inflection point? How much money do you need to get to that point? And if you get to that point, how much more do you need to raise, and who's going to do that, right? And so I have a company that needs $25 million to get to a clinical proof of concept. It's just not going to happen, right? But if the $5 million will get you to a first in human or your IND. So really, what we're looking is, how much you need to raise to get to what inflection point, and what is the probability of someone coming in at that inflection point, and how much? That's what we look at.
Yes, simply, it's how much money you need in total, how are you going to raise it, right? And if you can convince a strategic investor or an impact investor to invest even though the business model isn't great, is that all the money you need? Because if not, you're going to need to convince the next person who doesn't have that lower threshold. So, I mean, I think that, again, if you can find someone who can get you to a point where that math changes, maybe for that seed investor, you only maybe see a 2x, but for the Series A, it can be a 5 or 7, then you can create a path, and you can perhaps arbitrage some of these different criteria. But otherwise, you just need we always look at the holistic financing plan, right? And that's because I think pitfalls that foundations in the past or impact investors, strategic investors, impact investors have fallen into in the past is they fund it to a dead end where there's nobody left to take the baton.
Again, an important concept of thinking all the way through to the finish line. How are you going to get to patients, and what does it take for that to happen? And if you can get, somebody to put a lot of money in at the next stage for lower return, factor that into your calculations. If you think that money's there, if it's going to take somebody who needs a 10x return to get you there, factor that in too and see it. But it's sort of looking backwards, and from my perspective, I see all sorts of different cases out there.
And those rules of thumbs are based on risk adjusting, right? I mean, you're sure a top VC fund might actually return 10x, but they're looking for a certain percent return per year. It's just you need a couple 10x's in there in order to make that happen. So risk and portfolio adjustment. So I mean, there are examples where you say this is a lower risk opportunity. It's it's a gene therapy strategy as opposed to a small molecule strategy. The technical risk is lower. The biological risk is lower. The variance in terms of funding needed to get your answer is lower, and that multiple you're willing to accept is less than if you're going in at the same stage of a small molecule drug company. But so it's really hard to answer rules of thumb. I mean, the one thing that the DDF did do to try to differentiate our model from a purely financial model is we did extend the lifetime of the fund. So the DDF is a 15-year fund instead of a 10-year fund. So we can take a longer view with respect to returning capital to limited partners. But at the end of the day, we still have to match each company's financing plan to other investors.
I really don't understand the whole VC model. I don't know how to calculate returns. To be very honest with you, okay? I just don't. My background's a scientist. I worked in pharma. I helped develop drugs, put them onto the market, etc. But the problem is that innovation has no peers. So if you are coming in with something very, very innovative, everyone wants to see it de-risked before they're willing to put money in. And that's where we come in. And for us at Broadview, we can take that risk because we're unencumbered by the need to make a return. So, oh, that's great. Come back to us when you can show that it worked. Well, fine, we'll put our money in. We'll help you get to that. But we know that when you get, if that outcome is positive, there's potential for others to come in and invest. And that's sort of where we bridge the gap.
I think John, Chris, and John, it's well said. I totally agree. But one point I want to mention is it's actually quite hard to predict about your return, especially for us, because the indication we're focusing is a newly emerged. We're trying to create the investment market for T1D. So, for example, one of the investment when we just started the fund is invested in Semma. So that's a beta cell derived, it's a stem cell derived beta cell replacement therapy company. So at that time, there was no big deal going on for type 1 diabetes. But actually that company was just acquired last week by Vertex for $950 million. So that's kind of like you create a market, create an interest, and the returns actually pretty hard to predict, especially for newly emerging therapeutic areas.
Yeah, but I think the counterpoint is if you're in a space where there isn't a lot in the clinic, right, it simultaneously makes it hard to predict, but it's also easier to say there's the opportunity for a really large return. I think where you're in trouble is when you say we have some confidence that this isn't going to be good, and then you're hunting around for capital with a different decision-making structure. I think it's never in a good spot to be in. You say, oh, there are all these good comparables for what a drug would sell or what a device would be worth, and it's just not a lot. Then it's time to pause and think and investigate creative alternatives.
Here, I'm going to move on to the next topic here. Yeah, I think it's helpful, especially since we have a lot of entrepreneurs in the room here. perhaps if everybody could give a little flavor for what a typical deal looks like for you. What do you look at in terms of size, structure, stage, at what level you participate, instruments you like, various things. Just to give a little flavor for, say, people in the room, if they're interested in your, what you're looking at, and how some of these other topics play into that. Maybe what we'll do is switch it around and maybe you can start and come down the other way.
Yeah, so we, like I mentioned, we're early stage, so seed series A primarily, roughly 500K to 8 million. And one of the things that we're really interested in, a lot of our funds are reserved for dry powder too, so for follow-on funding. And that's kind of how our thesis is structured and how we approach. And I think I mentioned before, in terms of the scope, so again, any innovation that has very significant promise for treatment for psychiatric and neurological patient populations. Our biggest focus is on disease-modifying therapeutics. That's where we're going to allocate the most funding, but like mentioned, other areas too are open in terms of device, digital health as well. So I think that's kind of the main aspects. And we're agnostic to geographic region. We're not looking for specific areas, and actually we would be very interested in having diversification in that sense in terms of the geography as well.
So we are flexible in a number of investment parameters. So we make equity investment, also convertible notes, sometimes when we participate between rounds. And we our investment range from seed to clinical stage. And normally our first check is around single mid-digit millions, and we also reserve money for follow-on investments. The area we're interested, we actually prefer co-invest. Majority of our investments actually are joining syndicate, but we also, we've led deals as well. In general, we actually prefer to have deep-pocketed investors to invest alongside with us, so our investment can be catalytic. For example, one of the company, Squeeze Biotechnology, before our investment, it's a cell therapy platform company. Before our investment, they only focused on oncology. Then through our investment, they actually expanded to autoimmune and launched their T1D program. The area of the investment we are open to any opportunity have potential to cure, treat, and prevent type 1 diabetes. And we break those areas into 3 categories. One is immunotherapy to prevent and stop the immune system self-attack. Second is the beta cell therapies to regenerate or replace the beta cell of the patients. Third are the treatments to improve patients' lives before there is a cure. Those are our focus.
So I'll, to be brief, just try to focus on how we're different than a traditional life science VC. I mean, I think a lot of what we do, a lot of the investing we do, it follows the model that SV's been following for decades. So where we are different is that in the portfolio of 10 plus companies and programs we've invested is we will invest in seed stage companies or pre-company opportunities if they're sufficiently differentiated or there's enough white space and there's a need, and we will do those alone. I think in terms of amount of capital to work, because those generally are smaller investments, we've still put most of our capital into more established companies and with syndicates. With early stage companies and later stage companies, we do want to put a significant amount of capital to work, targeting up to 15 million pounds. But we do have actually 2 virtual incubators, one in London, one in Boston, where we have executives running these seed stage and pre-seed opportunities. So we will do that But otherwise, I mean, it's just very similar to a traditional venture decision-making process and allocation process when thinking about how we make our investments.
So before I start, let me just ask all you entrepreneurs, please don't take the SEMA deal as a benchmark, okay, for your deals. It is so far out of this universe that, okay, it's great return for investors. But as I said, we're looking to see what your next milestone is and how much you need to get there. And so that's the first thing. We're early stage investors, we're pre-Series A, Series A, but we're very data driven, so we need to see, for example, with the therapeutic, that you have mechanism of action related data, you have a lead molecule, you're close to IND enabling or already in IND enabling. If it's a device that you have a prototype, you have some large animal data to demonstrate that the prototype does work, right? If it's a diagnostic, it has to pass the so what test. How is a physician going to use that information from the diagnostic to change standard of practice? And then, how much you need to get to that inflection point. We also look very closely at the team. You can have the best scientists, but with a B team, it's not going to go very fast. We're looking, but a lot of our companies are virtual, so you might have a CEO and a CFO, but we're also looking at who your consulting community is, and so that's a huge part of what we look at too. So,
Any particular questions around those things? Those are pretty straightforward. Let me go with, I'm going to combine a couple things here, but let's talk about after you make investments, and how do you involve yourself with companies, board seats, hands-on, getting involved in management even, and what are your expectations from the companies in terms of what you want them to report on? Assuming it's more than just financials, what are you looking for them to provide you over the coming years all the way through the process, and where do you maybe even step out of the process and let the next round of investor take over? Who wants to start?
Our goal based on being mission driven is to I know there's varying thoughts on usage of the term value of death, but just to have a common vernacular. Our goal is really to help usher the company through that until they're to the point that they're de-risked, where there would be more broad interest. And so in doing that, we built our team around that to have different verticals of expertise to really assist the company. And given that we're a pretty specific focus, we have folks on our team that are neuroscientists that have a lot of experience in a lot of different areas that can help with the scientific aspect. We have folks that have a lot of experience with healthcare companies early stage that assist with a lot of the different hiccups and speed bumps and various things that can be hit. That a lot of the folks, PhD, MD, PhDs, that have very deep expertise in these areas of focus scientifically, but maybe a little bit less experience with some of the things that can come up. So trying to provide the support for that in the transition, as well as being clinicians too. So in a lot of cases, thinking about how will this translate to the healthcare system, and from not only an administration viewpoint, but also a clinician's viewpoint. There's things that can be absolutely brilliant, but it just does not fit into the healthcare system because there's not a CPT code or needs some tweaking to dial that in. And so we're set up that we are a virtual accelerator for the companies, that we assist in all those different ways, as well as outsource for additional expertise if needed. And so one of the things that, coming back to the original point, we really try to get the company sufficiently de-risked out of the quote-unquote valley of death. And there's a couple different strategic approaches with that. So one is specifically, most of the funds are allocated for follow-on funding so that it can keep things going. Another is that we've been working on diligently is finding other collaborators in the space that would be great to syndicate and help support these companies. And again, with the theme of trying to get them to the point that they're sufficiently de-risked.
So yes, we also reserve money for follow-on investment. And after our investment, normally we will actively support the company through the board seats and board observer seats. Also, we have a project advisory committee. So the Q&D fund, the investment team is based in Boston, but JDRF has a research team actually based in New York, and also has a regulatory reimbursement team based in Washington, D.C. So we actually bring the JDRF research and their regulatory staff to meet with our company regularly to discuss their Q&D progress. If there's any need from them, we will make sure to connect them with the right KOLs or farmer players and make sure to connect them with our resources. Those are the definitely actively participate in the post-management.
So we really believe we're value-add investors. We have an experienced team. We have a great network. Our limited partner base includes companies like Lilly, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Takeda, Astex/Otsuka. We have United Health. We have Quest. We have Gates, right? So we have access to a lot of resources that our companies can benefit from. That being said, it's a spectrum. I mean, there's some companies that we're coming into, and there's an established syndicate of active investors who are supporting the company, and we're more of a passive resource. And then there are companies we're getting in early, and maybe we're leading, maybe we're doing them alone, and then we're extraordinarily hands-on. We have had venture partners in the past who have run companies. We invest into these virtual incubators, which pay salaries of people who manage pre-seed and seed stage companies. So it is a spectrum. It's case by case, but and I could see circumstances where we invest where there's not a lot asked of us, but we certainly see ourselves as willing to roll up our sleeves and help our company.
Yeah, and I would say, we spend perhaps 60% of our time with our portfolio companies, whether we're observers or directors. Once we've made a decision, once the company goes through our investment advisory board, as a strategic advisory board, and we've decided to invest, we only invest $1 million, but if they need $5, $6, $7 million, we're going to help them raise that money. We just closed a RenovoCo out of Temple University. It started off with $3 million, and then my colleague Tom put the syndicate together for $11 million with Novartis Ventures and a couple of other people. So once we get in and we decide to invest in a company, they have access to all of our time and our resources. And then once the company is funded, if we're on the board, some companies were less active, some companies were more active. It just depends upon what they need, but we'll do everything to make sure. And then once they go on to their next round, I think most often than not, they want us to continue to stay involved because we know the area, we have the expertise in the therapeutic area, the connections, and sort of being the first investor in, we have the historical perspective, so.
Good. Looking at the time, why don't we open up some questions?
So I've heard some interest in getting the product to the patient, and I'm always amazed at the massive research that shows that a lot of products exist, they work, but they don't get to the patient. And it's especially true with generic drugs, like in the cardiometabolic area. Metformin is not only terrific for diabetics, but pre-diabetics to really stop the progression of diabetes. And the patients that need that are millions, and only 2% of the patients that need metformin get it. Is there anyone that focuses on solutions of the supply chain of getting, there's not a lot of excitement in selling a lot of generics, but is that something that's of interest to investors?
No.
I mean, so when I've been on prior panels, I was asked a different question, which was, what is the reason your fund exists, right? And the reason our fund exists is not because you can't get drugs to patients with neurodegeneration. The reason we exist is because there aren't any drugs for patients who have neurodegeneration and dementia. So I think if you were talking with a different strategic who is in that's why I was waiting to see what Christopher said. That was in a space where maybe that was one of the component challenges. Maybe they'd be interested. I mean, SV as a global management company has a health services and growth fund, and they invest in healthcare delivery opportunities. And I think depending on the model, you can, there are ways to have a business model, at least in this country, with healthcare delivery. But it's not for us.
And to your point, even though my background is diabetes and I'm very passionate about it, I would not invest in diabetes now. To his point, there's no drugs where they are. In diabetes, there's lots of drugs out of there. And so if you're going to come onto the market
Type
and
2 diabetes.
Type 2
Type 2 diabetes.
Type 1, you got insulin, but yeah. So, by the time you get to the market, who's going to pay a premium when there's so many generics in the market? So I would not invest in diabetes, but to your point, I think the delivery of getting drugs, increasing compliance, or those are a whole different area. It's clearly outside of I wouldn't know how to go into that space. And so we limit ourselves to what we know. Yeah.
I'll pitch in a little bit there. It's an area of interest. I would say I haven't seen anything investable yet along those lines, but when I think about pediatric conditions, there are a lot of things out there that have never been approved for pediatric use, and trying to figure out how to do that so you can get dosing right and you can do things off the shelf. There may be some things that just, somebody needs to dig into it, but you have IP complications where you may not be able to make the same kind of money because it's repurposed or just small works, but whatever it is. Trying to figure out an economic model that makes that investable, it's a priority of something we'd like to find. We haven't found it yet. Time will tell. We don't have time to do it ourselves, so we're sort of waiting on that. And if we, if we see it, we become interested. But it was easy. Somebody would have done it. So.
Thanks for all your comments. I think there are 2 or 3 of you that have captive corpuses of assets, but others are outside LPs, if I understand that correctly. Impact investing is more thematic today than it ever has been from the allocator's point of view. A couple of telltale stories from you all about what you're hearing from allocators and why they're allocating the way they are. Maybe it's diabetes, maybe it's neurology, whatever it might be. Are you seeing more demand from allocators in impact investing, or is it really a fad?
So the question is, why are LPs investing in our funds as opposed to, other?
Are you seeing, actually, the direct question is, are you seeing more demand than you might have 5 years ago because of the word impact investing?
I don't think it's because of the word. I think it's because there's more choices. 5 years ago, none of these, well, Broadview did, but most of the funds that label themselves as impact funds didn't exist.
Right.
So it's just a novel product. And so now people who were interested before, or could have been interested, now have choices to make. So I don't think that all of a sudden there's more stronger philanthropic urge, or, but I think if this fund had existed, and the fund wasn't created by the venture capitalists, SV didn't have the idea for the DVF. The LPs came together and said, it would be really great if this thing existed. We put money in, so let's do it and then figure out who's going to manage it. So I think because these exist now, you're seeing the money go in. I don't know if necessarily the amount of demand has changed.
So currently being on the trail doing the raise, it's been very interesting. I think within healthcare in general, there's a lot of folks that have a touch point for it, whether it be in the family, that kind of stuff, and I think. The sense is, and this is anecdotally, but having spoken to a lot of different LPs, primarily family offices in this context, that it seems like it's more on the radar, that they can do these things that have a touch point for their family. And so one specific example, one of the early LPs that we spoke with, they were looking through the deck, and it was a colleague as well, and so they're providing some advisement. And one of the first comments was, you need to take impact out of the deck, because it'd be perceived as being, concessionary and things along those lines. What's been interesting is with that family office now, that was about a year and a half ago, they're doing a fair amount of impact investing. It's been kind of the exposure to it, and they've transitioned. And I think that is getting a little bit more traction within the family offices. And I think a big thing too is that the perception that it has to be concessionary. There's studies now that are coming out that actually show that you average out a lot of the impact funds, and that it doesn't have to be, and it isn't necessarily concessionary, that it's actually equal footing with kind of match type funds.
Well, the ultimate concession is a grant, which they've been doing forever, right?
Negative 100% every time.
Exactly.
Two things that I'm seeing out there, which I can't really answer as to whether it's a fad or not. Time will tell. But right now, you're seeing increased interest from philanthropic organizations, mission-based organizations, in not making grants, but making investments. So that type of money
Getting a multiple so they can give more money.
is increasing. Right. Let's recycle money so we can put it back into our mission and all of that. That's something, with our foundation that was very much on our mind. You're also seeing a generational wealth transfer out there, and there's some pretty good data to support that. That there are large sums of money, again, a lot of private money that's going into early stage deals. The people making those decisions are shifting from 60, 50-year-old down to 40 and 30-year-olds who have a different worldview, is at least the theory around that. And the data would seem to support that, at least to a certain extent, that is true. They want to do some good things with their investments, and so there are at least things they don't want to invest in. So, the coal investments are out. Something that's going to help somebody is in. They're still interested in making money, but it'll be very interesting to see through an economic downturn how these things hold up. And so that's the fad question. I don't know. Time will tell.
Yeah, that was the point I was going to make. Is it's easy to make all those decisions when we're in a historic bull market and there's just so much liquidity. It doesn't matter what your model is. You can raise money. I mean.
But you got a 15 return, right?
Is it oversimplification? I'm just saying, I wonder which pool is going to dry up first,
Sure.
if when there's a market downturn, if it's going to be harder to raise money for the impact funds that all started, or is it going to be harder to raise money for the traditional venture funds?
But I think even where people are giving out grants, there is now an expectation of some return. So even all of the foundations that are giving out grants have a clause that if you make money from this IP, we get a little portion of that. It's very contrary to what we saw in 2014 when we hosted a healthcare philanthropic venture summit here in Boston. They say, no, we can't do that, right? Because we're a not-for-profit. And if you look at the Facebook guy, Zuckerberg, right? He's going to give all this money away, but he's not giving it away. He's going to give it in the form of investments. And Peter Thiel through Breakout Lab. So whether they give, when the market, when the economy goes down, there's liquidity goes away, they're going to stop giving. But I think what's changing is that they are now not just giving grants because that's throwing your money across, but they're making it as investments because they're seeing that way they have more control and there's accountability, and therefore there is a better chance that it will succeed. Right? And I think that's where your philanthropic money is moving away from vanilla grants to some expectations.
Thank you.
We've got time for one more.
How do you measure impact, and what are the LP's expectations of? Okay, we had a tough conversation where this is not what I expected, or how do you measure impact? I guess is a broader question. Are there any KPIs, given that it's become a fad?
Quick, we look at two metrics. One, how many dollars is our investment leveraging? So in other words, for every dollar we put in, how much money is coming in, which is at right now $11. So in the short term. And now that we've been around long enough, some of our products are starting to get to market. We keep track of how many patients have been treated by products from our portfolio. So we have a short term and then the long term. That's return on mission.
So for us, because we are a relatively young fund, for us, when we catalyze through our investment, we catalyze the good science and technology, maybe from a platform company which are targeting other indications But through our investment, they are actually applied to T1D, that's impact. And when we see this T1D field become more active, there are more investors seeing, there are more exit, like merger acquisition or IPO. All those things means this field become more active. Basically, we are building this investment market for T1D we see as an impact. But long term, of course, ultimately, we want to see their commercialized product getting to the market. But currently, we're just trying to promote more getting into the clinic, doing this development.
So we're early enough stage, I think similar to some of the others, that we can't really look at patient impact. It's far from that. So our approach is essentially twofold. So one is just cross-sectionally, and this is initial investment. What's their potential impact on the social cost? And so that's what I was alluding to before, that there's some indices from World Health Organization, how much impact does it have on society, the extent to which there's treatments out there or lack thereof that they would help fill that gap, et cetera, et cetera. So there's about 20 different indices that we look cross-sectionally. And again, it's their potential impact because they wouldn't be delivering it. And even across time, it still wouldn't be necessarily looking at impact for patients. So it's then longitudinally, it's how successful were they to transfer to the next step, bringing them closer to then deliver their innovation to the healthcare system.
We're getting the hook here. Thank you for attending. I'm sure everybody here is